welcome to our webinar on data centers. As board members would tell you, this has long been on our agenda to talk about. For those of you that are not familiar with the Northwest Toxics Communities Coalition, it was formed in 2007. It serves grassroots organizations throughout Alaska, Oregon, Idaho, and Washington, which is Region 10 of the EPA. We provide technical support for these organizations. We are looking at toxics in communities and working on environmental justice issues. We've got two board members present right now, Barbara Quinn and Darlene Schanfeld, both working on toxic issues in their communities. I see the grassroots organizations as the people who see when laws are being violated or improperly implemented. And so grassroots is essentially where the rubber meets the road, right? Whatever we are doing in our communities to protect our communities ultimately protects everyone. Excuse me, we've also brought aboard a new executive director, Jennifer Johnston, and we're happy to have her aboard. Currently, she's serving in a voluntary capacity as our members of the board. We are often organizations that are located in rural areas and where there's a strong influence by the polluting industries. So we welcome Jennifer aboard. And Barbara Quinn is going to be our question and answer regulator. She's going to go over the rules that we're going to abide by as we move through this webinar. And then, and then Darlene Schanfeld will introduce our first guest speaker. So Barbara.
Yeah, hi. Thanks everybody for being here. This is Barbara. I'd just like to ask people to hold their questions until the end of the presentation. If you want to put your question in the chat, that's perfectly fine. We will both field live questions if you raise your hand at the end of the presentation and also take questions from the chat. Is that correct, my fellow board members? Are we taking both? I believe we are. So why don't we just go ahead and proceed? If everyone can hold their questions till the end or put them in the chat during the presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Darlene Schanfeld, and I am a board member. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. We're so happy to have her and have discovered her for her great work that she's doing on this issue. Dr. Lauren Bridges is a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. Dr. Bridges researches the social and environmental impacts of digital infrastructure, and she's currently working on a book about the entanglement between land and data. She's also principal investigator of a 2.5-year grant from the Internet Society, Geographies of Digital Wasting, which traces the global flows of e-waste throughout the tech supply chain. Dr. Bridges received her PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania and from fall 2024, she will become assistant professor at Media Studies at the University of Washington. Congratulations on that appointment, Dr. Bridges. We know you'll do well. Okay, you're on.
Thank you so much for that really warm welcome, Darlene. And thank you all for providing me the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides. Hopefully they'll work as they did previously. Can you all see them? Just give me a little nod or a thumbs up.
Yes.
Great. All right. As I mentioned, it's a real pleasure to be here. As someone who studies, Darlene already mentioned that I'm currently a fellow at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. And I did just finish my PhD in the summer, and I've only just recently moved to Boston. And as someone that studies the environmental impacts of data centers, it's both a privilege and a bit of a concern to be in conversation with other communities dealing with the harmful impacts of data center development. And unfortunately, it speaks to the uneven nature of data center development, which occurs in concentrated locations around the US and around the world that have specific conditions, and it's creating what I call uneven geographies of digital waste. Today, my hope is to share some of my insights from my primary research site, which is based in Virginia, and to start an exchange of information so that we can learn from one another. First, I'm going to provide a bit of background on the global context of the data center market and industry, and then I'll delve into some more localized impacts. And as Darlene and Barbara mentioned, if you want to raise questions, please put them in the chat, or I'll be happy to field them at the end of this presentation. So according to market research, the data center market is estimated to be worth over $260 billion. That was in 2022, and it's anticipated to reach over $600 billion by 2023. And the United States is the largest market in the world, which makes up the estimates run anywhere between 35% to 40% of the worldwide market. As Patty we were just exchanging before we started this presentation, these figures of the number of data centers refer specifically to hyperscale data centers, which have a minimum of 10,000 square feet and capacity of at least 40 megawatts. So these are the large scale data centers, but data centers have all different types of forms. They can be much smaller than that as well. And as I'm sure you know, or have been thinking about, or maybe are unaware of the role of data centers, they're the unseen computational machine that is powering much of our digital worlds. So with every new app and device and AI model and cryptocurrency or streaming service that comes on the market, so too comes more demand for data centers. So this demand is not slowing down, and it's expected to continue to accelerate in the next couple of years, at least, if not for much longer into the future. Market analysts have identified several top and growing markets for data center development. And while Northern Virginia, where I focus, has held the top spot for the last 3 years, the Northwest is now being identified as a quickly emerging and growing market, with Portland snagging the top ranking along with Northern Virginia based on these factors. And this is one market study that assesses different markets for their attractiveness for data center development. So they consider fiber connectivity, the market size, cloud availability, local business conditions also play an important role, especially the tax climate and the development pipeline. And finally, access to power, abundant and cheap power, preferably land, and mitigating environmental impacts are also considered important factors for data center developers. So part of the demand for data centers in these two regions is being driven by access to both dense fiber locally, but also for fast internet connection. But also these sites are strategically located in close proximity to the undersea cable network. So that connects the global internet around the world. And there's been several new cables that have been laid on the West Coast, connecting directly to Southeast Asia, which might be part of what's driving some of the demand in the Northwest. So all of this demand for data centers is driving more energy consumption because, of course, data centers require a significant amount of power to run the computer servers, but also to power the air conditioners to keep the servers cool. Data centers are estimated to be responsible for between 1% and 3% of global electricity consumption today, and it's projected to reach around 4% by 2030. The average hyperscale data center facility consumes between 20 and 50 megawatts annually, which is theoretically enough electricity to supply around 37,000 homes. But it's important to note that there is no current consensus on the best methodology to measure data center energy use or its efficient or data center energy efficiency. And data center operators are notoriously secretive about how much power they consume. Many of the efficiency claims from data center operators rely on a popular metric, which is called PUE, or power usage effectiveness. And it's a measure of the ratio that describes the total power usage in data centers compared to how much power is used by the whole data center itself. So it's a measure of how much power goes towards servers in relation to the whole data center itself. According to the industry, PUE is a ratio, a perfect PUE ratio of 1 would indicate a perfectly efficient data center, whereby 100% of the power would go towards the IT equipment or the servers. That means that no power would be used for any other purpose in a data center, such as cooling or lighting or other overheads that support the equipment. But this also means that data centers running on older and less efficient IT servers may appear to have a lower PUE because the servers take up a higher portion of the overall energy consumption. The measurement also encourages operators to report the lowest possible energy use rather than measuring power consumption over a longer period of time, which might and also they're frequently inaccurate measures of the power usage in data centers. PUE was also first introduced by an industry group, the Green Grid. So it comes from industry as a measure for them to measure their own effectiveness. But the point of me going on about PUE is not because I'm an expert in this area, but it's just to highlight how it's often used in the models that project power usage from data centers into the future. And it's a deeply flawed metric. And while there have been several new developments that improve data center energy efficiency, from dropping servers into mineral baths to more efficient chip design, this 2021 study, where I've got a graph on the screen right now, it highlights how, contrary to data center industry claims, efficiency gains do not outpace, or they're not currently outpacing, data center demand for electricity. So that means that more data centers are going to put more strain on local power supplies. So finally, what these global estimates also don't take into account is how data center development is concentrated in specific areas like the Northwest and in Northern Virginia, where I mostly focus. And this places disproportionate burden on local power supplies. So that's why we've been witnessing all kinds of capacity constraints around the world. All this additional demand is leading to electric grid capacity issues and can lead to community trade-offs for other productive activities. So this was seen recently in West London, where there was a moratorium placed on new housing developments because data centers had already secured the electric grid allocations. Similarly, in Norway, a defense company was unable to expand due to a TikTok data center, which had secured all the local power supplies. In Northern Virginia, where Dominion recently put a temporary halt on data center development due to transmission constraints. This is leading to places like the Netherlands, Singapore, and Ireland putting moratoriums on data center development. Singapore just lifted their 4-year ban to mitigate the harmful impacts of runaway data center development that's happening really quickly and putting strain on local resources. So how is this happening? And what do we do about it? In my work, I've found that data center development frequently begins with a change in local land use decisions. So because land use is governed at the local level, this also provides an area ripe for community organizing to mitigate the harms of data center development. Importantly, the impacts of land use changes do not end with changing a land code from agriculture to industrial, for example, but rather land use changes have impacts that extend well beyond the physical plot of land and that moment in time. This is just a map from the National Land Cover Database from 2001 in Northern Virginia. And pay attention here to the red areas. This shows a bird's eye view of changes to the landscape over time. So this is 2001, and this is 2019. I'll go back again. 2001. If you pay particular attention to the yellow areas, which are pasture, agricultural, and rural areas, and the red is development and impervious surfaces. You can see how it changes over time. So importantly, land use changes frequently result in new productive activities that demand new resources and infrastructures to support them, from roads and water connections to increased energy supply and consumption and other inputs. New productive activities can also bring new and different kinds of industrial waste, and local land use changes for data center development therefore has these sprawling impacts that go well beyond the data center itself, and demand new resources while producing new discards. So how do we figure out what all of the impacts are? To help us make sense of these sprawling impacts, building on existing literature, I've developed a conceptual tool to assess data center impacts, which I'm calling an elemental taxonomy of digital waste. This is just one way that we might account for all of the impacts of data centers that frequently go beyond the physical site of the data center. So by elemental, I mean the old etymological sense of the term, which originally referred to earth, air, water, and fire. It's also a way to break down data centers as an idea into elemental components, or the resources and substances which data centers are composed of. This conceptual framework aims to help us think through the various impacts of data centers and how changes to land demand more resources while also creating more harmful outputs. And because my research is based in Northern Virginia, where this is where I'll focus my talk today, but wherever possible, I'll also try to relate to what's happening in Quincy and hopefully demonstrate how you can apply this same framework to your community. So thinking about fire, fire considers the source of energy production, particularly those that involve fossil fuels. It also considers the environmental impacts at the site of energy extraction, so mining sites, and production, and how data centers put a strain on local grids. And also are leading to these grid capacity issues in supply and transmission. Because burning fossil fuels is still the primary source of energy production, data centers are estimated to produce around 159 million metric tons of carbon annually, making them one of the world's largest polluters. And while data centers are estimated to account for between 1% and 3% of the world's electricity usage, in Northern Virginia, data centers account for 20% of all power sales, and their share is growing. So it's really important to underscore that these global figures sometimes obfuscate the local impacts, which are much greater in these concentrated areas. While Dominion, which is the local utility provider in Northern Virginia, it's a monopoly in Northern Virginia. So while they've been steadily decreasing their reliance on coal, they still do produce and use coal for power production. The long-term impacts from over a century of burning coal has indelibly changed landscapes and local ecologies. The environmental impacts from underground coal mining on land, water, and air quality are well documented, but impacts from surface coal mining which often requires mountaintop removal to access the coal seams, are just as significant. In 2021, surface coal mining in Virginia made up around 29% of Virginia's coal supply. And this is just an image that runs through how mountaintop removal happens. The impacts from mountaintop removal mining increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, lung cancer, pulmonary disease, and can lead to birth defects, and are estimated to contribute to more than 1,000 extra deaths each year in the Appalachian region, which is largely where a lot of the coal comes from for Virginia. Many of the same communities that are most likely to be impacted from mountaintop removal also come from economically distressed regions in the Appalachia. Downstream externalities from coal-fired power plants also cause air pollution and can harm water supplies. But also one of the legacy issues that continues long after a coal power plant has been decommissioned are the coal ash ponds, which contain cancer-causing chemicals and toxic substances, which, like mountaintop removal, disproportionately harm marginalized communities. A recent report by the Environmental Integrity Project and Earth Justice found that over 90% of coal-powered plants in the US contaminate groundwater with heavy radioactive metals and levels exceeding the EPA's health standards. Water contaminants include boron, lithium, sulfate, radium, and arsenic, among other things, which are known to cause cancer and impair the brains of developing children. Despite the reductions in coal power, the report estimates that the industry still generates around 70 million tons of coal ash each year, and is estimated to have contributed approximately 5 billion tons of coal ash in the past 100 years. Most of the sites as well where they store coal ash are unlined, like this one here in Chesterfield, Virginia above, which basically means you dig a big hole and then you throw coal ash in there and you pour some water on top and hope it doesn't spread. But alarmingly, these pits are also often located close to surface water, owing to a lack of transparency in reporting, and many residents living in close proximity are unaware of their presence or the potential threats to their drinking water. As reliance on coal is slowly being curtailed, both gas and nuclear are making up a larger portion of power generation and consumption. Nuclear, of course, offers several environmental benefits, such as decreased carbon emissions and less air pollution, but however, the mining and refining of uranium and manufacturing and also the manufacturing of building materials that go into the construction of nuclear power plants, such as concrete and steel, also require significant amounts of power. But one of the most significant impacts of nuclear power is the potential for widespread contamination in the event of accidents or meltdowns, and then in the disposal of radioactive nuclear waste. Nuclear power plants also require significant amounts of water. Natural gas also emits significantly fewer greenhouse gases and air pollutants than coal or oil when burned. However, extraction, production, and transport of natural gas poses several environmental risks, including air pollution from methane emissions, water use, and contamination from hydraulic fracturing or fracking, habitat destruction, and induced seismic activity or earthquakes due to the human interventions. In 2021, the EIA, the US Environmental Information Administration, estimated that CO2 emissions from natural gas combustion for energy production accounted for around 34% of total US energy-related emissions. So it's still a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. The energy profile, of course, for Washington state looks very different to Virginia, with around 67% of all power coming from hydropower, which is a really great story. And Washington is known to be the largest hydropower producer in the US, making up around 31% of the nation's hydroelectric generation. Washington also is one of the, among the top 6 states in the nation with the lowest average electricity prices. So these factors combined, access to renewable energy and lower power prices, will make Washington an attractive location for data center operators, particularly those that are looking to lower their environmental impact while keeping power costs low. And although hydro is the main source of power production, there's still, of course, ongoing risks from coal, gas, and nuclear. The TransAlta Centralia coal-fired power plant is located approximately 5 miles northeast of Centralia, Washington. And although the power plant has slowly been decreasing its capacity, the first unit was turned off in 2020. The second unit is scheduled to be decommissioned in 2025. Like Virginia, the legacy of both coal mining at the site and coal power production will continue for several generations to come. The residual ash waste is disposed of at this site in 2 pits. One is lined and one is unlined. And currently monitoring wells on the site have detected dangerous pollutants, including arsenic, cobalt, lithium, manganese, and sulfate, well above the recommended guidelines. And then located just 75 miles south of Quincy is the Columbia Generating Station, also known as the Hanfield site. And I'm sure you all know about the history of it, but it was interesting for me to learn about it, that the Hanfield site was the first nuclear reactor in the United States and part of the top secret Manhattan Project. And for more than 40 years, Hanfield produced plutonium for America's atomic weapon program. The reactors required huge amounts of water to keep the cores cool, and cooling water contaminated with radioactive and hazardous chemicals were then discharged into the Columbia River. Site operations also included burying contaminated solid waste on site, and these activities, contaminated soil and groundwater with radioactive constituents, heavy metals, and other hazardous chemicals. The magnitude of the radioactive contamination at this site is just staggering. Much of the waste is liquid, and it's stored in the 177 underground tanks, 70 of which are reported to be leaking, and about 500 contaminated buildings on the site. So today, the Columbia Generating Station is the Northwest's only commercial nuclear energy facility and is the largest electricity generator in Washington state, behind the Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph dams. The site produces about 8% of power generation in Washington state. So in addition to energy production required to support data centers, transmission of electricity is also increasingly becoming a core concern. In Northern Virginia, this recently led to a pause in development for data centers due to bottlenecks in the power supply, but development has since been resumed. The transmission issues are a particularly sensitive issue in Northern Virginia. Following a fight that happened back in 2014, a dispute erupted when local residents learned that Dominion Energy planned to enact eminent domain and build a 110-foot tall, 230 kilovolt transmission line that would cut through their properties and the surrounding foothills. Although the project applicant was protected by a non-disclosure agreement, residents soon learned that the line was required to service a single bulk load customer, Amazon. Then local coalitions formed to protest the planned transmission routes, including a proposed route that would run through Carver Road, which is a settlement mostly comprised of elderly homeowners who are descendants of freed slaves. After a long 4-year battle, the community effectively petitioned the state to require Dominion Energy to bury the transmission line along an interstate highway. The other major outcome of the dispute was the establishment of what is called a data center development overlay district, which came out of meetings with the community members and Dominion Power and data center developers in order to find an area in the county that was appropriate for data center development. And this was already in an industrialized area that had space for data centers. And it was determined by the community or the different community groups that this wouldn't negatively impact the surrounding communities. The overlay district was established to prevent these lengthy and costly legal disputes, but unfortunately, several recent developments have been proposed outside the data center overlay, which is a 10,000 acre area, even though it has still significant vacant land for data center development, including there's a proposal for a 2,000 acre data center campus currently that's being debated outside the overlay district. So unfortunately, even though the community fought to have this space identified as a reasonable place for data center development, yeah, it's currently not, it doesn't hold a lot of weight in the current proposals. So in addition to air pollution caused at the site of energy production, data centers also contribute to air pollution from diesel generators, which I know has been an issue in Quincy. And the limitations on power supply are also leading to increased reliance on these generators, and will continue to in the future. In Northern Virginia, Dominion Energy recently announced that they will reach grid capacity by, well, they were due to reach grid capacity by mid-2023 due to persistent data center development. And following their announcement, a temporary air pollution exemption was proposed that would allow data centers to run diesel generators 24/7, which then led to huge community protest. And as a result, the proposal to suspend the diesel emission regulations, the relaxing of diesel emissions, has been tabled for the current moment. But as I mentioned, these issues are going to continue. And so it's possible that that could be put back on the table in the future. The use of diesel generators would add to already burdened communities. So this is a project called Mapping for Environmental Justice. And they found, and this is an area in Northern Virginia that's seen a lot of data center development recently. And they found diesel emissions to be high in areas that have seen both data center development, but that also run along major highways. These issues then correlate with the cumulative environmental justice impact, which considers socioeconomic factors of vulnerable communities, including poverty rates and high proportion of people of color, unemployment, high school degrees, housing burden, and speaking English fluently. The project found that Virginia's vulnerable communities are nearly 5 times more likely to be exposed to air pollution from traffic and 3.6 times more likely to live near a Superfund site. Similarly, in Washington State, the Department of Health created an environmental justice mapping project, which rated Quincy as a moderate to high risk for diesel pollution and disproportionate impact. And this is also based on several factors, such as the percent of population with limited English, household income, percent of people with a high school degree, people living in poverty, unemployment rate, and the percentage of people of color in the region. Hyperscale data centers, of course, also use millions of gallons of water to keep the servers cool with the industrial air conditioners. A medium-sized data center of around 15 megawatts uses about 400,000 gallons of fresh water daily to cool the servers, or as much water as would be needed to run 3 average-sized hospitals. Data centers also consume water indirectly at the site of electricity generation and in other sections of the tech supply chain. While some data center operators have started using reclaimed or gray water, many data center operators still largely rely on potable water, and often from water-stressed regions. But also data centers pose a risk to the quality of local water supplies due to the increased development in rural areas. So in Northern Virginia, the Occoquan Reservoir, pictured here, provides drinking water to around 800,000 residents across 3 counties. And following a spate of planned data center developments in Prince William County, including the 2,000-acre proposal that's currently being considered, residents pressed policymakers to complete a long overdue water study. An article published in Nature Sustainability shows that increased salinity levels in the Occoquan Reservoir are due in part to anthropogenic development, including from data centers. In March of 2022, Fairfax Water, which is in an adjacent county, which provides drinking water to over 2 million residents in Northern Virginia, pleaded with Prince William County planners to conduct a long overdue water study. In the letter, they cited a recent study, the one by Nature Sustainability. And basically, what this letter highlights is how local planning initiatives in one county can often pose a direct threat to surrounding counties who have limited or no jurisdiction to prevent land use changes outside of their county. And unfortunately, to date, a water study has not been completed. So part of the threats to the water source are driven by the increase in impervious surfaces. Changes to impervious surfaces increase runoff and impact local water quality. So land uses largely determine the water quality conditions of a region. And, this has led to increased salinity in the water supply in Virginia. This also means that the Occoquan Reservoir is currently listed on Virginia's dirty water list. Changes as little as 2% of land use can affect the water quality in a region. So as I stated at the beginning, land use changes often go well beyond just the plot of land and can pose threats to the local air quality, water supply, and local community health. Land use changes also add to the growing urban heat island effects, and land is also displaced in the production of energy extraction and production of energy, and also poses risks at the other end where e-waste is disposed of. So these are just some maps of the urban heat island effect in Northern Virginia that show heat inequities in areas that have seen a lot of recent development. This is also similarly happening in Quincy. And then finally, to the issue of e-waste, I won't go too much into detail because I think I'm running over. But essentially, data centers are filled with thousands and thousands of servers that need to be replaced every 2 to 3 years. And e-waste is the largest, fastest growing waste stream on the planet. So as demand for data centers continues to increase, so too will they contribute to the e-waste problem, which is also a global issue, as a lot of the e-waste produced in the global north is then offshored to the global south. While some e-waste is recycled, the vast majority is not. An industry estimated that in 2021, there are around 18 million servers in data centers. And as I mentioned, they need to be changed every 2 to 3 years. But since 2021, we've seen a lot of development. So I've come to the end of my talk, but what I want to leave you with is the framework to start to think about the various impacts that go beyond the data center itself and consider how demands of data centers have vast impacts that go beyond that single site. Digital waste from data centers comes in various different forms, from pollution, from fossil fuel-based energy production required to power data centers, to the millions of tons of e-waste that data centers contribute to the growing e-waste crisis. And these are frequently overlooked in local decisions around new data center development. But luckily, local organizing around land use changes offers an area ripe for community action and involvement. And I think Stephen is now going to talk about some of the potentials for these interventions from community action. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much.
So I'm thinking that probably several people have questions. I did not realize that the chat was turned off. So if you have questions you want to put into chat, or you'd like to raise your hand to have them addressed by Lauren, now would be a good time. And I apologize for that. This is a new feature on Zoom doing this pre-registration. So I'm learning as I go. So if you have some questions, please feel free. Barbara Quinn, can you see those questions?
I see a question there that says, which European country had more than 1,000 centers? My data is from 2021, so I'm sure it's changed, but the United Kingdom, and this again is hyperscale data centers, had around 451. There's no European country that has over 1,000 data centers, according to my research.
Okay, this is the person who asked the question. It was one of the purple circles in that first map that you had, and they had the number 1,000, and it was around Europe.
Okay, we'll share the screen again if you like. This one, is this the screen? Oh,
Yeah.
I think that's North America. Is that the
No,
one?
it's
Or,
above-
oh, I see, 1036. I think that's a region. It's not a single country.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Darlene has her hand up.
On one of your early graphs, let me get my question here. The amount of information stored, it looked like it was a flat line over the many years. Is that right?
Could you repeat that, Darlene?
Yeah, you had a graph up where you showed the different, there were maybe 5 different lines in different colors. And one of those was, let me get my, the amount of information stored. It was a blue line. There were a couple blue lines that could make the differentiation between the colors, but it looked like the line was flat, and that surprised me. Not that one, maybe the one after, there. Yeah. And it says storage. So is storage pretty flat or going down, or? Oh, I can't hear you. You're on mute or something. We lost.
Sorry.
There you go.
There we go. This particular study is measuring the energy consumption for different parts of data centers. So the servers themselves, which are the computers, are making up the vast majority of energy consumption. Storage is an element within servers themselves. So yeah, they may not themselves consume that much energy compared to the computers that process all of the data. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Welcome. Should I field the questions?
Yeah, I see that Jean Mendoza has asked a question. Jean, go ahead.
She might be on mute.
She asked a question in the chat.
Oh, in the chat. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
He has her hand up.
Yeah, she does too, but I asked her to unmute and she hasn't done it.
Okay.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the chat, actually. One of the questions from Jennifer Johnston, do you want me to look specifically for Jean's? Jean is asking, do you have a human life? Do you value a human life at 6 million? What is your source? Human life does not have such a high value where I live.
Jean, I'd love to know where that $6 million figure came from, but I personally think that life is invaluable and you can't put a price on human life.
And then Jennifer has a question as well. Jennifer Johnston asks, where are the proposed data centers in Portland? How can I find out more about that?
So I found the Portland figure from an industry report. I was actually really surprised to see Portland competing for the top position, to be honest. how you find out about these things is a really tricky question. I don't know in Portland how you would go about that, but how I go about it in my own research is to keep an eye on local planning meetings. So one way that you could find out about it is by going to the local county website. Most local counties, I think all of this information is FOIA requestable. So if they don't have a all of the recordings from a local county meeting available online, many do though, you should be able to request them. Ideally, they'll probably have them available online. And then what you can do is you can look through, this takes quite a bit of work, but what you would do is you look through the agenda and see when they're voting on various different proposals, because they will have to approve unless it's zoned in a particular area that's already zoned for data centers, that otherwise they'd have to approve the land use change. So that's one way. Another source that's incredibly valuable is local journalism, which unfortunately has been under threat for several years, but local reporting will usually identify planned developments in an area. I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry it's so cumbersome as an answer.
No, it does help. And one thing I do know is that I think it wouldn't be Portland. I think it would be Hillsborough. I think they have Intel. They have all of that that's out there. So I would think they do a lot of toxic stuff in Hillsborough that it would seem like maybe they would have so that's at Washington County. So maybe looking there as well, or going to the Oregonian. Those are great suggestions, and I will I'll look into that. So thank you so much. Thank you.
So I have a response from Jean. Jean asked the question, Jean Mendoza asked a question about the $6 million. She has a response in chat. She says, sorry, I'm on my phone due to computer problems. The human life value comes from a table on costs that included heart attacks, hospitalizations, etc. It is nice that you think a human life is invaluable, but that is not how people in my community are evaluated.
Yeah, I'll bring up that chart right here. So this source is from what is called the WikiGem Global Energy Monitor. It's a wiki site, and they come up with these estimates of how many deaths and heart attacks and various different health impacts can be attributed to particular sites. And it's an imperfect science for sure. What they're trying to do is highlight how particular sites contribute to local health impacts. So I don't think, I just want to be clear, I don't think this is supposed to be a measure of how much life is worth, but it's supposed to be a measure of the cost to a community. So I hope that helps answer your question.
So this is Barbara again. I'm not actually able to see if people have their hands up, but I can see the chat. So if there's somebody with their hand up, please go ahead and feel free to interrupt. But we do have one in the chat as well. Have another one in the chat. The one in the chat is from David Finley, and he's asking, obviously there are local groups pushing back against data center development, but are there larger national or international groups making this push? Are governors, representatives, or senators listening to these calls for more consideration before data center expansion?
This is a great question, David. In terms of larger national and international groups coordinating action against data center development, I haven't seen it. The most I've seen are researchers, and this is biased of my own area of expertise in my own communities, but are researchers that research that brings up all of the impacts, but I haven't seen any kind of global or trans-local coordination of these efforts, although, you know, it's my hope that we will be able to start that. Instead, I see a lot of local fights that end up coordinating around the issues as they come to those communities. Are governors, reps, senators listening to these calls for more consideration before considering data center expansion? Yes and no. In Northern Virginia, we recently saw a change of political leadership in Prince William County, the county that I've mostly focused on, where the Board of County Supervisor, the chair of the board, was very, very pro data center development, and she'd been in the position for several years. She also had a profile of investing in data center businesses, which she got called out by the local community, and partly because of that, I think she started to divest because there was really intense conflicts of interest when she's economically benefiting personally from approving these data center developments. And in a recent election, she lost to an incumbent who she lost to a challenger who ran on a platform of reining in data center development. So our reps and senators listening to these things? Yes, to an extent, but I think that there is also a political wave of community action that's forging political change, which is really hopeful to me. And I think because of all of this action, it's made governors, the governor of Virginia is not so concerned about data center development, but it has made some of the senators more responsive to these community actions.
So
well-
Patty, how are we doing on time as far as the questions?
It's 5 minutes to 11. I figured we were transitioning at about 11.
Okay.
Thank you for that question. I did want to mention that Congress is very much aware of the power consumption issue and wants data centers to reduce that, right? In the case of our providers here, because it just takes one big line to go to the data centers, they lowered the data center costs and raised everybody else's. We've gone from like 3.25 for our kilowatt hours to over 6, or it will be over 6 soon. And also to respond to another question about how do you know if there's a data center coming, many times there are requirements that they have to publish a public notice. And so because it's a local decision, right? And so oftentimes you'll see that public notice if you still have a local newspaper, or find out where your Department of Ecology has to publish those public notices, because there will be, or your city has to publish those because there will be some sort of public notice that's going to be required. I did have 2 questions for you that I think you put up a map of Quincy. Did you put up a map of Quincy as a heat island?
I did, yeah.
I really want a copy of that. When I first got involved in this, I was getting an anonymous email from a person who finally, came forward and talked a little bit more with me, but said that we were going to be a heat island. And you literally, when you see the weather on the news, you can see it go around Quincy now. It does not go through Quincy, it goes around us. And then finally, I was wondering if you have looked at all of the waste with these diesel engines. I've been inside one of the containers of these. I mean, these are locomotive size. I mean, these are engines that can power a train, right? And inside, the walls are lined with liquid batteries.
I didn't see that in the one that I visited.
Yeah, well, here in Quincy, they're lined because you can't just go straight to, I mean, the engines don't respond right away.
Yeah.
And so there has to be a transition between them, and that's where the battery comes into play. And these are liquid, like I'm assuming they're nickel cadmium, but they're big containers of, I mean, just line the walls. And I wondered if you had looked at that, but I guess that's another thing for you to look at.
Yeah, that wasn't in the one that I visited. They didn't have those batteries. So that's really interesting to me. It makes sense. But they also they only used the diesel generator as like for testing at that point in time. So they would plan for it, and they had several generators, so they would still have power, and then they would plan to test the diesel generator. So I think it will become an increasing issue if data centers were relying on diesel generators, for example. But that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, in our case, the data centers are allowed to run their diesel engines 30 minutes before an electrical storm and
Right.
up to 30 or 45 minutes afterwards as it passes. And so, my understanding is those batteries are a key component so that you don't have a surge, because you can't have any surge
Right.
without losing data.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Should I
Uh,
continue to field questions, or should we come back to this after the next presentation?
I think we're right on time for the next presentation. Unless Barbara, you want to, if there are other questions out there, we could take them.
There's no other question. Jean has a comment. Jean just wants to note that 60% of the diet of people, the original people in Eastern Washington, I'm assuming she means indigenous people, were based on salmon runs, and the water situation is really crucial because the dams that produce electricity have cut off the salmon and salmon spawning grounds. She's pointing out the fact that the salmon are now on the verge of extinction. So,
Yeah, thank you for that point, Jean. It's a really crucial point that of course hydropower is not benign, and certainly also has environmental impacts and will impact local ecologies, and the local diet of people. Thank you.
Okay, Jennifer, you have the next introduction.
Yeah, so I'm just going to introduce our next speaker, and that is Stephen Gonzalez Montserrat. He's a postdoctoral researcher in the Fixing Futures Research Training Group at Goethe University in Frankfurt. He's a recent graduate of History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, and Society, the HASTIS PhD program at MIT. Dr. Gonzalez ethnographically investigates the environmental politics and impacts of data centers in New England, Arizona, Puerto Rico, Iceland, and Singapore. Committed to public engagement and accessible scholarship, his writing and research appears in venues including Wired, Eon, Popular Science, Anthropology News, ABC News, BBC News, NPR, and more. And that is our introduction. Unfortunately, he has contracted COVID-19 and was not able to join us, but he offers his condolences, and he has provided us with a pre-recorded talk. Thank you.
My name is Stephen Gonzalez Monserrate. I am a recent graduate of MIT's History, Anthropology, Science, Technology, Society program. And I'm now a postdoctoral researcher at Goethe University as part of a research training group called Fixing Futures. It's my pleasure to speak with you this morning. I regret that I can't be there live. So today I want to talk with you about tried and true approaches to organizing against data centers. And I think this is really important because, as you'll come to learn in the course of my talk, as well as Lauren's, are the real material impacts of data centers for communities and for the environment. And we'll go a little bit into those, but I want to focus on what action looks like, because I think that's really crucial as data centers expand and come into more and more communities. I'd like to first ask you a question, which is simply, what is the cloud? Now, the cloud is something that's really difficult to define. In the data center industry, in the tech industry, it has a really specific meaning for a specific kind of data center or scale of storing information and remote computation. But for most people, the cloud is everything that the internet touches. It's your devices, it's servers and data centers, it's cell towers and satellites. It's this vast meshwork of many different infrastructures and technologies that are working together. And so in order for us to kind of have a better sense of the scale of that, and also the impacts of such a vast network of systems that are nested and plugged into one another, I want to kind of bring you into my field site, my research, which is on data centers. And so since 2015, I spent a lot of time inside of data centers, which within this large set of infrastructures of cloud, they're where the data lives, they're where the remote computation happens. So that's where everything is stored and where everything is processed. And one scholar that I'm really influenced by, his name is Nathan Innsmenter, has called these the factories of digital life. And so these are where all information is being processed and stored. Now, I'm an anthropologist, so that means I'm studying this issue with a very specific lens, and that's the lens of ethnography. So for many of you, ethnography might might be unfamiliar, right? And so my best way to define it is it's an approach to learning or approach to research that is really based on direct observation and the deep cultivation of relationships with people. So spending time with people in a specific setting, community, or practice, and trying to learn from them, as might say a student or a trainee or an intern. And so for me, as a anthropologist of data centers, I took on this role of the intern very often, or the spy, as some data center technicians used to call me. And so I spent a lot of time shadowing technicians like Raul and many others in Puerto Rico, in Iceland, in parts of the United States on the eastern coast, as well as the desert Southwest region, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. So in the course of doing this research, I learned what it takes to operate a data center. Both the technical skills, the embodied skills, the knowledge, but also I got really close to many of these systems, the servers, the air conditioners, the power distribution units, the diesel generators that are always operating in a kind of standby state just in case. I got really acquainted with the security and the many pressures that these men, and it is a very masculine workforce, it's a very male-dominated industry, even more so than IT in general. Data center management tends to be very, very skewed towards men, and so that's a whole other issue that's really important for us to address. But so this environmental ethnography that I conducted over the course of many years now had a kind of comparative angle. And I wanted to know, is running a data center the same in the Arctic? Is it different in the desert Southwest? Is it different in the tropics of Puerto Rico or Singapore? What are the different constraints and conditions that data centers operate in different places? And what are the different inputs? What are the different outputs? Are they more environmentally impactful in certain places over others? So this is the question that motivated my research. And I had the privilege and challenge of doing a big part of this research during the pandemic, which was a time where data center operators were essential workers. And so they were under a lot of pressure to keep cloud services running, because we relied on it so much during the pandemic to do everything from like remote meetings like this one to to virtual events, virtual work, so forth. So the demand for IT was incredibly great at that time, and data center operators worked around the clock to keep things running relatively smoothly. And so over the course of my research, I discovered really 4 primary sets of impacts that data centers have to the environment. And it's really important to also note that these impacts, while they are global, how people experience them is actually very local. And that is incredibly crucial. So when we talk about carbon emissions, and this is part of the reason why climate change activism has been met with such resistance, is this sense of, well, it's not happening yet, or I'm not feeling it yet. And yes, there are people who are already feeling it and have been feeling it for quite some time, the effects of climate change, but others have not, or have been insulated from the worst of it, or have so much other infrastructures and supports that whatever the changes are, they're not as impacted by them. And so that is why it's really important that, yes, the cloud is emitting, is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's primarily because of the electricity that it consumes, both to operate and to cool. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But I want to really emphasize the more local impacts. And so one of the ways that we can see that playing out is the way that data centers, since they use so much electricity, the average data center uses as much electricity as a small city in some cases. And so that is very much felt by local grids when they have to apportion these electricity resources to an entire nation. And now you have one industry that's taking up, in the case of Ireland, over 20% of the grid's electricity. So that creates situations like blackouts and so forth. So that's a very local kind of impact. Then you can think of water. And so water resources are really scarce throughout the world. Freshwater is being threatened, freshwater reserves, as a result of climate change. Desertification is a key driver of climate change, and yet data centers use a lot of water to operate. And so we'll get a little bit more into that in just a minute. I also look at waste, all of the different waste that cycling devices like your cell phone or servers and so forth, every few years they have to be replaced. And so there's this proliferation of waste, which does not get recycled to any kind of significant degree. And then that poses huge challenges both for the present and the future, as these rare earth minerals and metals that these things are made out of are also in short supply, and they're procured in really grueling, horrific conditions in so-called artisanal mines in places like the Congo right now, which is embroiled in a conflict, which has in large part to do with these minerals and metals. And lastly, probably the least understood issue is noise. And my case study that I'll present today will illustrate some of those dynamics. And so just kind of quickly, I want to overview and explain from my insights from working within the cloud, why is it so dirty? Why is it so polluting? Why is it so environmentally impactful? It has to do mostly with this. You've all seen this message before. It's server unavailable. It's whenever the digital fails you in some way, when there's some kind of technical glitch. This in the industry, we call it downtime, and it is supposed to be very rare. And it actually is quite rare. I mean, I think we've all experienced this, but we don't experience it every day or every hour. We experience it very rarely, and that is a testament to the cloud's resiliency, its redundancy, its and the work of these men that I described earlier to make sure things run smoothly. And so what the cloud is like for the most part is in this state of uptime, where everything is running smoothly the way it should run. And in order for it to run smoothly, it has to be climate controlled so that it's sufficiently cold to operate, but also has to be protected from all kinds of threats like squirrels that chew cables. One of them downed a Yahoo data center in 2008, very famously, and caused millions of dollars worth of damage. and losses and business losses and so forth. But this state of uptime is one that has to be constant. And so most data centers measure their uptime in percentages around 99 point something percent. And so the point something percent of failure is, so it just goes to show how rare the failures are. But there is a cost to this. There is a cost to having a system that runs so smoothly all the time, that seldom fails, that seldom breaks. There's a huge environmental cost. And so I spend a lot of time in data centers, tidying up cables, prying open floor tiles to increase airflow. And really the main task that I spent a lot of time helping facility managers and IT technicians to do was to thwart the enemy of the data center, which is heat. And heat is the byproduct of all of this computational work that we're doing every day, all of this storage. You put a lot of computers together in a single space, you electrify them, they do a lot of work, they emit heat. And so heat is something that is very visible in the data center, and it's something that is constantly being conditioned against with air conditioners. And so air conditioners use a lot of electricity. There are also other methods of cooling involving water. We'll get into that in just a moment. But this is the reason. So in most data centers, almost 40% of the electricity that they consume is devoted to cooling in some way. And so that is almost half is just keeping the waste heat in check. And the rest is for the operations and so forth. But this is an operation that, as I said, it's built on so many redundancies and so many resiliencies. So if the power goes out, there's another power system at the way. If one server fails, there's 10 other ones that have the same information, so that you, the user, don't experience any kind of hiccup. Even if hiccups are happening, you're just not even aware of them because there's so many redundancies in place to prevent that. And all of this has a cost. The electricity that data centers consume is significant, and if we include all the devices that they're interacting with, and pretty much every ICT, as we call it, information and communication technologies, the total greenhouse gas emissions estimated in 2022 by the International Energy Agency is 1.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that might not sound like a huge number, but it is roughly equivalent or comparable to the aviation industry, just as a kind of food for thought. But I don't think that this should be what motivates action. I think we should be looking at the local effects and the local impacts of these data centers, and that's where this action should be motivated from, not these abstract numbers, which themselves are calculated very dubiously. There's no mandated reporting requirements of any kind, really. And so these figures are generated based on very estimated guesses, estimations, educated guesses, what information is publicly available, and various maths that are, This is Chandler, Arizona. I spent over 6 months here researching data. So in the greater Phoenix metro area, there are a dozen data centers and more on the horizon that are being constructed. Of Phoenix, but right behind me, from the perspective of this photo that I took, is a hear this. So what I'm going to play for you is a clip that is actually what this noise of the data center sounds like. Now, as you can see, the data center is behind this concrete wall, and this is what it sounds like around in this park. Now, to me, it sounds like a jet revving for takeoff, but now hum. Some of this is like a sub-bass frequency. The rest of it is audible as a kind of like shrill, constant noise. And this noise has been particularly troublesome for a can kind of travel really unabated. And this has caused them all kinds of health issues. So everything from insomnia to and these are things that the residents went and got diagnoses of as part of real cost to having data centers right in the middle of a community where people live. And those considerations, but this is a very unregulated industry. So the data center companies are not required to do this. They're not compelled to do this. Anything that they do to mitigate the sound is because they want to. But there's a significant cost associated with minimizing the noise in data centers. And so that is where you or where anybody who is interested in doing activism around this issue, that's where you come in. Create the demand for this. Now, at first, I thought this was an isolated incident in Chandler, Arizona, and so that I was somewhat skeptical, even though I had experienced the sound for myself, and I didn't live in Chandler, but I lived in Mesa for the time of the field work, and every time I came, I could hear it, and I got headaches myself from being exposed to the noise for too long. But then, very one after another, this US. So in particular, Northern Virginia, which has the largest cluster of data centers in the world, has numerous activists have propped up and are reporting this noise pollution. Carolina and Arkansas, in Printers Row in Chicago. So it's also in urban environments, not just suburban environments. And so these are real serious these are serious issues that are affecting. If a data center comes to your community, this issue could arise for you as well. Now, noise, unfortunately, is not the only concern that people should have when we're talking about data centers. Artistic illustration, which protects the confidentiality of my informants and research participants, that shows you a modular data center. And now centers are kind of like the size of shipping containers, and they're particularly useful in desert environments because they have a specialized cooling system. It's called evaporative or adiabatic. And this has given, because of the way that this kind of cooling system works, which is very water reliant, and so there's a lot of moisture that escapes in the process of cooling the IT equipment in these So a person perspires and the sweat evaporates.
I'm going to let it take a minute to maybe, because it keeps buffering. And I'm just wondering if it's trying to run ahead of what is available, although I have the best internet, fiber internet that the state offers. So let me give it just a minute and I'll start it over. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that this video that Stephen has put together is one that will play all the way through without issue once we have it posted on the Northwest Toxics Communities website. In the meantime, I'd like to see if it will, after it's given a little rest, if it will continue to play. And technology is not my thing, only fighting it is. So give me just a minute. Let's see.
Good morning. I spent on the design of other communities. Serious artistic illustration, which protects the confidentiality of my informants and research participants, that shows you a modular data center. And now these modular data centers are kind of like the size of shipping containers, and they're particularly useful in desert environments because they have a specialized cooling system. It's called evaporative or adiabatic cooling. And this has given, because of the way that this kind of cooling system works, which is very water reliant, and so there's a lot of moisture that escapes in the process of cooling the IT equipment in these applications. My informants like to call this place the mouth because they hated working in here, and it was particularly difficult. Now, just to kind of give you a sense of how it works, it's a lot like how you sweat. So a person perspires and the sweat evaporates, and that temperature differential from the moisture escaping into the air creates a cooling effect because water is a great convective agent. It's really good at removing heat, at being a heat exchanger. And so in these modular data centers, water is pumped up into this spongy filter media, which is like very much like almost like styrofoam, but or like almost like a foam that you might use for a mattress as an additional padding. This foam it absorbs the moisture and then also all the particulates and corrosive agents that are part of the water supply from the Colorado River. And so this evaporative effect cools the servers, and it works very efficiently in these data centers. And it actually reduces their carbon emissions and electricity use significantly. However, it uses a lot of water to operate. And that is causing a lot of problems in a place like Chandler, Arizona, in the desert Southwest, and where there is a mega drought, the likes of which has not been seen in centuries. And water is being apportioned to this industry. And this is also not an isolated incident. A recent study published in 2021 has revealed that over a fifth of data centers in the US are located in moderately to severely stressed watersheds. And these data centers, a single data center can consume as much as 3 million gallons of water per day. Now, going back to what I said about the sediments and the particulates inside of the Colorado River water supply, but many other water supplies, this water that the data center uses can't be endlessly recycled. And in the case of the mouth that I showed you before, it evaporates into the atmosphere. And so water is lost. It can't even be reclaimed even if they wanted to. And so there's also the hazard of bacterial growth, which I've seen with my own eyes, the way that bacteria can grow in these places in the pipes and anywhere where there's moisture and heat. That's where bacteria loves to thrive, and microbes. And so because of this, the water is not recycled, or it's chemically treated, and or the water is recycled only on a limited basis. So a significant amount of water is used by data centers for cooling in these dry settings, but also in many other settings as well. And so that's really important, because as more data centers are built and water supplies in the US are being threatened in general because of climate change, because of overconsumption and so forth, that this adds another pressure, another layer. And what we're seeing now is, attempts to try to understand the amount of water that data centers use. While there are a lot of different figures floating, and I won't repeat them because I find them to be, maybe not so useful, but saying that like a number of queries on ChatGPT is the equivalent water use of this. Is these are again estimates, guesstimates, and so forth. But the reason why studies around ChatGPT are coming to bear is because artificial intelligence is computationally intensive, and so unlike just storing information in a server, when you do artificial intelligence applications, when you do gaming, or when you do metaverse type applications, the computational resources that you're using are much higher. The amount of energy and the amount of water to cool that energy, to mitigate that energy that's created, the heat that's created, is much higher. And so as a result, we have to be really cautious about the AI boom, because now the AI boom means more water, means more electricity, means more resources, used for cooling. But I think, again, it's not so useful to think in terms of this, in terms of these numbers. It's more useful to think about the local. And so we have the case study of Valencia, New Mexico, where farmers are struggling to get enough water to grow crops, while the data centers have, enough water to do what they need. And so we really have to think about our priorities, where water is being apportioned to computers, but not to people who want to grow food. And so, this is a real concern for communities when a data center comes in. You should think of all these things, because data centers have a very specific local footprint and impact. So now I want to just close with a few pointers that I learned from my time embedded within a coalition of activists in Chandler who were trying to get some justice for what they were going through with respect to noise pollution, but later also the water footprint of data centers in Chandler. And as I said before, if we think about this on a global scale, I don't think it's very useful, because the that we're facing to be able to regulate multinational corporations like Google, Amazon Web Services, and so forth is really enormous. And it is possible, and I think eventually it might happen, but regulation at the kind of local level is more promising and more possible, I think, for many reasons. And so one thing that's happened in the last 3 years, which is really very, very inspiring, is that this resistance to data centers, this grassroots resistance and activism, is spreading. We've seen it in the Netherlands, we've seen it in Ireland, where, as I said earlier, the electrical resources for the island are not equally distributed, and data centers are causing all kinds of issues. We're seeing it in Chile, in Santiago, we're seeing it in the Netherlands, we're seeing it all over the world now. And so that means that there is precedent. And once there is a precedent, there is more possibility for action, because you can point to what came before, you can point to a concrete success. So my first tip is to create a community organizing platform. And so it's really crucial for activists to gather the constituency. The people who are affected by the data center need to be assembled in one place, whether they're taxpayers or they're part of some kind of political constituency, municipality, county, whatever. This needs to be formed. It can be through in-person meetups at a local community center, or ironically by using social media, so using the cloud to organize against the cloud, which ended up being the case with Chandler, Arizona, where the Dobson Noise Coalition formed on Facebook as a Facebook group, and they had their own website, but the Facebook group is their primary organizing mechanism. And so these can be really helpful because, you know, information can be shared, recordings of the sound incidents can be posted, and announcements about public meetups and events can be created and set up with reminders and stuff like that. So it's a really good to use some kind of digital platform to be able to organize, but also it can be public, or it can also be private in the case of if you're dealing with a particularly hostile data center that might try to infiltrate and so forth, which I've also witnessed and experienced. That can also be a challenge. So the second step is to gather data, because without data, it's difficult to make a case for any kind of action, resolution, or mediation. And so that can come in a variety of forms. If it's a qualitative experience of harm, then creating a survey for a community is really important, because once you create and conduct a survey and have survey results, and it can be something as simple as a Google form. So you do not need to be a qualitative researcher or scientist to do this. It can be a Google form where people can log incidents of, say, a blackout that might be related to a data center, or it can be an incidence of noise, whatever the case. This is really crucial. So create some kind of data collection mechanism. You can encourage people in your community to record things using cell phones with voice recorders, images, any kind of documentary tools that are at your disposal. The other thing you can do is if there's suspicion of, say, utility bills that are increasing as a result of data centers, you can gather utility bills and create a kind of longitudinal maps and compare them across different neighborhoods and so forth, and see if there are patterns. And this is all really important, because without the data, it's hard to be taken seriously and to be credible in the eyes of the key stakeholders. And so one of the things that I did for the coalition was help them to create a Google form, which was a way to log noise incidents. And this is really handy because you can then see trends and patterns and what is shared and what diverges. And also you have data that covers a longer period of time, so that if people are trying to dismiss the incident as a one-time incident, you have more information over a longer period of time. The next step, and it's probably the most difficult and the most crucial, is to present your findings to stakeholders, which is the catalyst for some kind of action or resolution. And so the stakeholders can be everyone from local officials who run your city or town or municipal government, to the state level, to the federal level as well. So the U.S. senators who are assigned to your specific state, right? But also you can think about the state senators, state reps, local reps, city councilors, the mayor. All those people are people that you want to try to bring in. And if you can't get them in there, you can get representatives from their offices, which was the case for us. You also want to be in contact with local media, and also beyond the local media, try to get national coverage as well. But it usually starts with local media coverage, as was the case for Chandler. It's also important to bring the people who are the offending party to the table, or make space for them at the table, so they can come to this event, whether it's a community meeting or whatever, and they can either sit and listen, or they can present their own information about what is going on. And then I think the most important is to bring in external experts of various kinds. So you can have anthropologists who study data centers, or you can have scientists who know a lot about sound, so who can conduct sound studies of the area and determine whether or not the data center is causing noise pollution. Or you can have people who study some other technical aspect of this issue and bring them in as well. And it starts slowly, and it can be a very long process of resistance. But if the sooner you start, the better, because once a data center is on the dock to be constructed, once it has been zoned, it is very difficult to site it somewhere else. So once the siting has been signed and put into stone, now it's just a matter of mitigating the harm of whatever the specific site that has been chosen. But if you can be involved in the process, if you know a data center is coming in a community and it hasn't been sited yet, and there isn't a specific place or a deed or plot of land that it's going to be on yet, it's really important to be involved in that early process. And if not, then it becomes, a little bit of it, then it becomes damage control. Grievances have been aired. Now it's about what can you do to actually solve the problem, or if not solve it, minimize the harm or reduce the harm. And so, one way to do this is to have the community to actually draft letters to the editor, which enumerate the action items or resolution road that he hates the data center, it's really noisy. That's great, but it's better if the Greenwood noise community writes a letter collectively that enumerates the harm. Here. And then, sending targeted emails for follow-up action on the part of the people who might have attended any kind of community meetings, and also posting on social media. And it took until 2023, January 11th, for the city to finally pass So now there's a precedent that can be cited for future issues going forward. And if you want to stand up for environmental justice in your community, you have to make noise. you have to meet regular. Until the regulatory landscape shifts and larger regulations can occur at, say, the federal Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'm available to correspond with you via email if you have further questions.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that. I'm going to leave that email up there for you. I apologize again for the buffering. I can see there's just a couple minutes left, so I let it continue to go. But he did say,
Patty, you're breaking up.
oh dear, I am too.
You're okay. Now you're okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stephen did say in the email that he sent that he's available for any questions that you might have about his presentation by email, and I'll type that into the chat here. And then I think if, obviously we can't ask any questions to Stephen, but if there are any remaining questions for Lauren that you have, this would be a good time to ask. Okay, if,
Patty, I just have a comment. This is Barbara. I thought there were a lot of interesting aspects to his presentation. One of the most interesting to me was the grassroots resistance forming in, he listed a few places like Ireland and Netherlands and yeah, in European countries. I don't think that's happened here yet, but I thought it was really interesting to make note of that. I would like to look into more information about that.
Yeah, sadly, I actually had people from Ireland that had communicated with me, and I could only share with them the way we were going about it. I mean, we did do letters to the editor, and we did try to get people to come out to meetings. And, you know, I think this was covered in Lauren's talk, or certainly in Stephen's, that it's not only the resources that they're looking for when they place these data centers in communities, but they're also looking for communities that might pose less resistance to the placement in the communities. And that would be a good description of Quincy, unfortunately.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm pretty sure that we have something, either a data center or something closely related to it in a building, a very significant building that used to be a bank. A beautiful building, very large, that is on our civic corridor here in North Portland. And it has completely enclosed itself. All the windows have been covered. And anyway, I'm doing some research on that right now. It seems like a very inappropriate place for such a thing, but yeah. There you go.
And I don't know whether this is true or not, but I was told by someone who worked at one of the data centers here in Quincy that when the Dell facility, which now has changed names, was constructed, that they put up missile impenetrable walls.
Wow.
I mean, these really are terrorist targets, right?
Huh.
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge what Jean has put in the chat as well, which is that in her community that the city cannot deliver drinkable water and Native Americans are disappearing, and that all of this discussion about community organizing, it is, I guess, doesn't take into account or is a hopeful narrative when communities are dealing with such severe and important issues. And that really is the challenge of doing this kind of work. In Northern Virginia, in the communities that I've been in contact with, a lot of the organizers are wealthy white property owners that have inherited land over generations. And, you know, they might, like those properties might have like heritage to slavery, coming from tobacco farms. So this kind of intergenerational transfer of wealth has now allowed several landowners to become really active participants in resisting data center development. Hopefully, these communities are also joining forces with communities of color that are experiencing the same issues. And so I see a very hopeful narrative there, that they're sharing their resources and their knowledge with one another to uplift and help one another. But I think this underscores such a crucial point, which is that it just takes so much work to bring together these resources. There's a lot of obfuscation. There's a lot of secret, it's very secretive throughout the whole process. Certainly I've seen several cases in my field site in Virginia where there were data center developments were, they're not even named data centers. They're called like technology corridors or the digital gateway or whatever. So it's actually really hard for community members to even know what's going on in these sites. And the operators are protected by non-disclosure agreements. So yeah, if we can share information in these formats that will help one another, I think that will potentially help. And, you know, maybe it speaks to the need to build a collective database of resources that can be shared, especially for organizing among community members. I'll end there. Go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, thank you. First of all, congratulations to whoever put this together, and the speakers have been absolutely astounding. And I'm going to try to share the recording to various teams that I'm on within the Sierra Club. But Patty, I wonder if you could tell us how if there was any organizing going on in Quincy and how you did that, kind of in response to what Jean has asked about.
Well, yeah, we tried to organize. We tried to get people to come to meetings, to, you know, both the ones that were public and then also through letters to the editor, and then personal contact with people that you knew were connected in the community, and people were not willing to stand up. Again, I kind of see this as almost a rape and pillage mentality, right? They're coming in and they're using all the available resources. And in our case, I guess this is something we talked about before everyone came in, but they gutted the clean air rules for the toxic air pollutants that were very stringent for our state. They gutted those in 2009 to allow these facilities to come to town, and it had to be a benefit not to our community, but to the state. I mean, that was part of the rule change, and there was no additive effect of these individual carcinogens, which would have been in the rule. They set a goal of 100 cancers per million, which is, you know, that's not a typical standard that you set. That's usually one that would be considered not acceptable, but for our community. There were attempts to organize, and then it was at a point where you had to do something. And so that involved getting data and filing motions and challenging the air permits themselves. The Department of Ecology was actually allowing people to construct the facilities before there was actually an air permit that was put in place, which made it impossible to remove them.
Yeah, I've also seen that practice as well, where land use changes get approved before they even know who the tenant is, which is a way around considering the full environmental impacts of a development. And it speaks to like this contradiction in the planning process, where sometimes land use changes will be approved before development happens. But certainly there's a challenge even in Northern Virginia for bringing people together to do the work, to do the research, who have other priorities. You know, they have competing priorities. They have jobs, they have families, and it takes a lot of work. One group of community activists that have been particularly active is actually a group of retirees, where a data center is being planned adjacent this retirement village, and you know, they've got time on their hands, so they've been able to do a lot of ground research. But it really shouldn't be up to, you know, it just shouldn't be up to the individuals and the community members to be having to do all of this work and educate yourselves and you know, to become citizen scientists to keep data center operators in line. We really need more measures at the federal level. That's certainly something that I've been thinking about in my work. And while I'm here at Harvard and housed within the law school, I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm surrounded by them, and I'm constantly talking to them about my ideas around policy interventions. because I think this is a really big issue. And the fact that we're currently leaving it to the local level, it's not going to solve this problem. Although, again, I do see a lot of hope in local organizing. It's kind of like the last frontier of stopping this development in many ways, but we need much more comprehensive approaches at a federal and a state level that look at these impacts.
I will add that there are environmental impact statements that have to be filed when these facilities are coming. And if your community, if your elected officials are doing their job, they will look at the environmental impacts. In the case of our community, it was a DNS every time, a determination of non-significance, which then put the burden on us to do what we could to, mitigate whatever was coming to town. And it was a retired school teacher and a substitute teacher at the time that, did the best we could.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this just before we began, Patty, is that many of the impacts are it's a kind of slow violence. That's a term Rob Nixon, who's an environmental researcher, created. It's a slow violence in the community that the impacts are actually cumulative. It's not one particular data center that's going to, cause destruction to the local water source, but changing the land use over time is going to, increase the heat index, and eventually it'll affect the water source, and it's going to be for generations to come, which is part of the challenge with these environmental impact statements. For one, they look at only that particular site. They don't look at how it's contributing to a cumulative effect. So yeah, there's many things that need to change.
It's a really interesting insight.
Yeah, Barbara, I don't know, can you see the hands or not?
I cannot see the hands, but I am monitoring the chat.
Yeah. Elaine Packard has her hand up.
Yeah, I think Darlene was before me.
Are the lands, and Patty, maybe you can answer this, are all these private lands or are any of these DNR lands?
No, they're private, and they're selling for more than what a typical farm would sell for. The latest land sale in Quincy was 55 acres for almost 10 million.
Sorry,
So
how
they're
much?
purchasing land. Okay, so they're not Department of Natural Resource
No.
lands.
Nope, these are all farmlands that are now being taken out of production and these things are being cited. And in our case, because of the way the law is written, where it has to be located within an urban growth area, within a county, within an urban growth area, all of these data centers are sitting right at the, right in the city, right? And in basically a 2-mile line with 400 engines, over 400.
I see Elaine also has a question.
So what kind of changes can we ask for? I know that some of the data centers are using green energy and some are recycling their water. I mean, short of saying we don't have any of them, which we know is not going to be the case, I didn't hear enough about what changes we can ask for.
Yeah, this is a great question. So locally, I would ask for environmental impact reports that look at the cumulative impacts. So in Virginia, one of the studies that has been that the community have been really pushing for is an updated water study. So that's just one impact. And what they want to see is how has the cumulative impact of this development, how is it impacting one of our most precious resources? But there are also calls to look at other impacts on air quality, on the noise that Stephen got into in certain areas. So yeah, pressuring local policymakers to go beyond that environmental impact statement for just the one site. Although, although those environmental impact statements are useful, they do often leave a lot out as well.
But
Yeah.
like, what mitigation strategies are there going on? I mean, you can look at the study and you see the problems, but what are the mitigations for those problems is what I'm wondering
Right.
about.
I mean, besides preventing development, besides like
Yeah, provide,
questioning
yeah.
all
Yeah.
of the land use changes that have been going on, which is, you know, for me, that's an area where I think there's, you know, a ripe area for community intervention is to prevent the land use change from changing from agriculture or rural area to industrial. But besides that, so there are industry practices that mitigate harms, for example, using mineral oil. So what that is basically it's a non-conductive solution. They drop computers or the servers into the mineral oil, and it means it keeps them cooler. They don't have to use so much water, and they don't have to use so much power.
Okay.
It's proven in the industry to be effective, but it's expensive. So that's a potential area that, you know, that we could ask for, you know, more development in that area so that they reduce their impacts on water and power. Also putting them in climates that make sense, like putting them in cooler climates, or I mean, in the Nordic countries, they've got a lot of data centers being built in caves in areas that are already much cooler, and they're also using the heat. The heat that comes off of servers, they're recycling it and using it to heat homes. So I guess there are industry practices where they're trying to mitigate the harms, but also, you know, use the outputs of data centers in more community-friendly ways, and ways that might reduce people's energy bills and heat bills. Yeah, this is all going to be context dependent on the climate that you live in and that you operate in. But yeah, personally, like from looking at all of the impacts, it's a deeply, deeply unsustainable industry. It demands significant resources at the community, local level, and at the global level. There is a concerning pattern of data center developers looking for rural and agricultural land, and once that land is paved over, once that concrete has gone down, it's really difficult to pull it up. And that's why I have tried to highlight in my talk some of the other impacts that aren't really being raised when data center operators come to town, which is, you know, this is going to have impacts that go well beyond this site. It's going to mean less water penetration into the water table. It will mean increased runoff, increased risk of floods, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but the fact that you've got more impervious surfaces can increase the water runoff. It increases toxic flows into local water supplies. Yeah, it's deeply concerning to me that that local small rural communities are being targeted for development. Yeah, I'm still scratching my head as to what some of the interventions are.
Yeah,
so.
and just finally to say that it sort of begs the question. I mean, they need land, so where are they going to go if they can't go into big cities? I mean, if that's kind of what you need, then, you know, what do you do?
Right. And the cities, you know, the land is too expensive, and it's not, the plots of land aren't big enough. They're in Virginia, the data center operators were surveyed along with the community, and they all were like, yeah, we want greenfield sites. We want sites that are undeveloped. That's why they're also not building in these industrial areas, because it's cheaper for them to just build in rural areas. So long as they have access to power and water and fiber, you know, these are much more attractive areas to them. So I'm open to suggestions though from the community, and I'm certainly thinking about them myself.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I think Jennifer asked about money. How much was it 55 acres sold for, Jennifer?
Yeah, sorry, I was just, I missed what Patty was saying. You cut out for a second. So you said that the farm sold for more than it usually would, and I wondered.
Oh, yeah, 55 acres sold for just under $10 million. And I should correct that. When we were looking at the map, we weren't sure if it's both of there's two 55-acre parcels that said they're owned by the same family. And it may be that it's 110 acres for just under $10 million, but substantially more than what farmland would typically sell for. And so the incentive here, right, is not the farm. If you're adjacent to where one of these data centers is going in, then you might have hit the jackpot.
And that's happening in Virginia as well, especially that big plot of land, the 2,000-acre planned proposal has like 57 property owners, and many of them were against data center development in the area, and they wanted to stay in their rural homes, but they ended up getting pressured into joining this coalition of landowners because they were told basically you're going to be surrounded by data centers.
Mm-hmm.
You can either sell your property for $1 million an acre, that's what's the price in Virginia, or you can hold out and be surrounded by data centers and your property won't be worth anything in the future. So yeah, it's it's deeply concerning, and it's, for many of the landowners, like it's not surprising that they would want to sell their land for that much money. It's the fact, though, that local policymakers are the ones that approve that land use change. They cannot sell that land to a data center operator unless it's been rezoned for that use. And so that's why I really am on the land use changes are the area where we need to intervene.
Thank you. Yeah, sounds right.
Any other questions for Lauren? So you're already starting to see thank yous come up in the chat. This was a phenomenal presentation. I'll be sure and send a note out to Stephen as well. It's still not something that people know, the environmental consequences of these data centers. Still probably a pretty well kept secret. So.
Well, thank you for your time and for your attention, everyone in the audience. I'm also, happy to answer questions as they come up. And, maybe in the future, we'll be able to start a conversation between the different sites so that we can share, future organizing tactics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Okay, unless there are any other questions, we'll let Lauren get back to her East Coast activities, and Merry Christmas to everybody. It's not too early to say that now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Merry Christmas, everyone else.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone who came.
Bye-bye.
Bye.